Good evening. Welcome to another webinar hosted by the America Chair on Technology, Innovation and International Regulation. My name is Esther Zalin Adu, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Before we start, I would like to mention a few words about the chair. The America Europe Fund strives to be a platform that supports academic cooperation, exchanges, and research to disseminate and strengthen comparative knowledge of European and American societies. One initiative that supports our mission is the America Europe Chair on Technology, Innovation and International Regulation, which aims to provide interdisciplinary research and expertise on regulatory developments in Europe and America. Through these activities, we promote opportunities for cooperation and knowledge sharing amongst stakeholders across the Atlantic. Today, we have the distinct pleasure to be joined by Professor Elaine Fahey, who is Professor of EU Law at the City Law School, City St. George's University of London, and Deputy Head of Department in charge of academic programs. She's also co-convener of the Institute for the Study of European Law at the City Law School. We have also in Munich Ms. Julia Friedlander, who is currently Chief Executive Officer of Atlantic Berg, Germany's top platform for transatlantic exchange and professional network. And before coming to Berlin, she spent 2 years at the Atlantic Council as the founding director of the Economic Statecraft Initiative, which handles the intersection between finance, economics, and national security. Today's discussion is centered on the emerging geostrategic environment that is set to redefine transatlantic economic relations for decades to come. Both sides of the Atlantic are currently engaging in comprehensive industrial and economic security policies that are reshaping the transatlantic trade bloc. Concurrently, we're also witnessing an age of incredible technological leaps, from the expansion of AI tools to the dawn of quantum computing. Thus, at this point, we are right to assess the prospects and feasibility of deeper EU-US regulatory cooperation in emerging technologies, especially the factors to consider in this new landscape that could impact the prospects of such cooperation. So, as a way to situate our discussion for our audience, in your view, what key factors, trends, or recent events characterize the current geo-economic environment in global economic relations? We'll start with Julia and then Elaine.
Thank you. And thank you so much for organizing this. It's always a pleasure to speak in a diverse fora about some of the most pressing issues that are on my table, at least in the organization that I run. We are a network of politicians and industry and journalists and academics who work on a daily basis in the transatlantic fields. I came to Germany after 15 years in Washington, working on a lot of these regulatory policies, starting at the dawn of TTIP negotiations, and of course, ending when we were looking towards the Trade and Technology Council as the new sort of revamped version of how the US and the EU were going to do a regulatory dance around each other. And in between, of course, we had the Trump administration, #1, which was not necessarily all that bad for many of these regulatory issues. We got stuck on a lot of tariff disputes, which we're coming back to in a hurry right now. But it was actually a period in which we were able to renew the Privacy Shield agreement, and also start developing a framework around how we were going to deploy particularly export controls and investment screening policies vis-a-vis China. So when I joined, I spent 3 years at the White House as a detailee from the Treasury Department. And when I got there in March of 2017, most people didn't believe me when I said that the biggest issue on the transatlantic agenda was going to be China. Everyone sort of looked at me like I had 3 eyes or something. A few months later, of course, that we were all guns blazing, and we had started to discuss what the Biden administration then sort of took off with, which was essentially a friend shoring or ally shoring construct. that would allow us to look at what key technologies sort of cross the boundary between being internationally competitive to belonging to international national security. And so, if you heard throughout the Biden years, friend shoring and ally shoring, small yard, high fence, which was, of course, Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, his sort of broad sweeping metaphor for it. But all of us were sort of looked at this a little bit critically and said, well, how small is the yard and how high is the fence and what belongs to this category and what doesn't? And I wouldn't say that the strategy was necessarily the wrong one, but it certainly wasn't watertight, because, there's a certain economic principle of scarcity breeding creativity, and the specific goal of the Biden administration to rein in China's access to high-end chips, to slow its development of artificial intelligence, and therefore limit their military industrial complex vis-a-vis Taiwan. Again, 1, 2, 3 hopping. Clearly proved to backfire somewhat when the Chinese came out with DeepSeek just a few months ago. So again, we see, much of governments sort of swirling around how they interact with allies on critical technologies. Right now, it seems to be there. You have a sort of two-tone system. There's part of the U.S. administration that is still doing tuned regulatory work, right? On export control policies and sanctions and investment review, like all the sort of invisible stuff that the Commerce Department and the Treasury Department do on a normal basis. Of course, all of that is being overshadowed by Trump's apparent willingness to wage some sort of tariff war on all of the world at once. And not like sort of indiscriminately of what product is being tariffed and what is being restricted or not. And so right now, I'd see that they're sort of a sort of throw all things into the air. My prediction is that this is going to backfire on the administration. Either that or Trump's going to take a bad deal to get out of the back door before it backfires on him. And we're going to find, and we're going to end up within a couple of months back into a this discussion based not from the government, but driven by firms themselves that work transatlantically on how to find the a regulatory convergence and arbitrage vis-a-vis high-end technology. So it's sort of like I'm as unhappy with the current situation as probably everyone is, but I see it as sort of like an escalate to de-escalate, just based on the guy in the big house.
Thank you, Julia. And Elaine, go.
Well, the last while has been a very interesting time for transatlantic relations, partly because the EU and US were converging in so many ways, apparently, at least on its face, as the EU took on the geopolitics of everything, the geo-normalization of life. EU law and policy was much more outward facing all of a sudden across the board. And I suppose the question for me, certainly understanding the broader environment, is how much on its face were they actually, have they been converging, or was the EU experiencing a very different White House with a different message, but a lot of the same content, as it were? And the EU has been very much forced to discover this question of having an industrial strategy and living in a world that is not as rules based as its DNA is suggests. The EU is a rule of law creature. It's based on very boring institutional treaties that don't give lots of scope for things like executive orders, like Donald Trump's capacity to sign orders on plastic straws and so on. To do that in the EU is a massive regulatory leap, and having to discover that the Biden administration was very much wedded to soft international economic law was a big shock for the EU. So to see a new White House, in some respects, the EU has had to become accustomed to very different fashioning of technology, of economic partnerships, soft law, which is not like the EU is very much a hard law creature in its DNA, that it wants institutions and organizations, it needs the WTO and so on. Working outside these structures has been very complicated, and also having to do a lot more with the US and sanctions, I think, has been a very interesting touch point for understanding geopolitics. There was, incredible convergence and institutional convergence, and I think, as Julia mentioned a moment ago, a lot of the technical part of the nitty-gritty of the work still continues, but the broader framing, may be quite different. So I would describe myself as a cautious, optimistic pessimist in a world of pessimistic optimism. Perhaps that to understand transatlantic relations, I think, is to see many different types of engagements across many administrations, and that have very divergent approaches to public international and institutions, but ultimately have been very well served by certain points of convergence. But I can talk later about data, but data flows is obviously a very significant part of that's really come together in a different form in recent times.
Okay. Thank you for your remarks. So I just want to step back a bit and see from an EU and US perspective what key factors that we often overlook contributed to this environment. Julia Rendy mentioned Trump, also China's emergence as a global economic actor. Elaine touched upon the view from the EU, but concretely, what other key factors contributed to this current geoeconomic environment? We'll start with Elaine and then Julia.
Well, I think China is a very important part of the story or the matrix, obviously, because China has been the one thing that's united the EU and US. I remember interviewing a diplomat in the last number of in recent times who said that, maybe the US doesn't have anything like the regulatory infrastructure of the EU, let's say, on data issues, but the way to get each other's attention really is to speak about how we fashion China. And I think that's definitely one part of the story. I think also there's been very important work done on developing countries and understanding different forms of matrices of countries, particularly work on worker-centered trade policy. A lot of USTR policy became very ingrained into EU thinking as to how to refashion its trade view of things, and having become very defensive and protectionist in the first post-Trump era, I think there certainly was a new character to this. I think Ukraine obviously has been a very important convergence point in the transatlantic relationship in more recent times. So those are perhaps our much longer lasting elements of those points of convergence and divergence that really refashion the future. And China certainly doesn't go away. If anything, it operates as a huge springboard for the EU's efforts to relaunch itself without the transatlantic support to its relationship. So yes, those are very, very clearly the elements that are there to understand the current context.
And Judy?
And I think, and I try to sort of think about when the mindset sort of tilted against globalization in the sort of in Washington or in the greater American psyche. And it seems to be like in my mind, like mid-Obama administration, or in Germany here, also sort of midway through the 16-year term of the chancellorship of Angela Merkel. Where you started to see, and I think Elaine just hinted at it, sort of this, okay, we now see the implications and the impact of China's accession to the WTO, and that it has abused its development country status to our increasing detriment. What I find a little bit sort of myopic looking back is that we were so convinced, I say we, as in, the greater West, and this is sort of also like the other example of this is Germany's approach to, auto investments with China, is so convinced of your like innate economic advantage to think that by opening markets that like trade policy won't apply to you, basic trade policy, which is that all participants will experience a net greater increase in wealth participating in global markets, but also there's a convergence of wealth, right? So that's basic trade there. If you take trade 101, that's what your professor is going to tell you on the first day. But somehow we ignored that because, we were America, we were the EU, and, the German Volkswagen, it was like a big rotating star, and that it wasn't going to touch us. And so right now, I mean, I think a lot of what you're witnessing is between like the end of the Obama administration, the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, and now the Trump administration is again all struggling with these new concepts of how to deal with a relative decline of American power. And so, that I mean, that's why, the US not showing up to the G20 now. I mean, you could say, okay, they're not showing up because because of the mistreatment of white South Africans, right? I mean, give me a break. It's clearly because maybe it's a pet interest of Elon Musk, but also because, showing up there doesn't mean you get what you get what you want anymore. I mean, the G20 itself was created by the US Treasury Secretary thinking about, okay, I have this big financial crisis, the Eurozone crisis, the financial crisis. How are we going to get a new system of players together to create some new rules for financial regulation? So the G20 was elevated actually by the Brits, because it was the British G20, to help resolve the financial crisis. But lo and behold, the G20 isn't just our playground anymore to show up and say, I'm gathering the world at my table to solve my problems. Everybody else has problems too. And so this sort of, it sort of smells a little bit of sore loser syndrome. And I think that's what we're dealing with here. And, if there's anyone who sounds like a sore loser, it's Donald Trump. So there's, again, I think we have to hit a little bit of a lower point before we get to some sort of new concept of what global trade will look like that will be some balance between industrial policy, because if you think about it, looking back at major leaps in technological and industrial advancement have never happened without a big role of the state to back, the private sector can't take that much risk, especially if you are a market-based economy. So we're going to be seeing some form of industrial policy, some form of protectionism, market protectionism, and a lot of plurilateralism, right? I mean, you see, again, everyone talks about the big players, you have the Chinese over here, and you have the Americans, and everybody else is supposedly caught in the middle. It's not exactly true, right? Well, first of all, we're seeing that the European Union is ready to integrate more now in the face of what's going on, what Washington has threatened, and the war in Ukraine. But you see all these different players. I mean, no one's really paying attention to what the Indonesians are doing, or or the Brazilians, or the Turks, or the Saudis. I mean, everybody's trying to figure out how to use this situation to get a new comparative advantage in this global situation. And there's all these trade arrangements that are being made between middle players that have nothing to do with WTO rules. So again, we have to hit a new basis for global collaboration, and unfortunately, some China is going to be broken in the process. And that will end up with a relatively weakened United States. I mean, doesn't necessarily have to mean that the United States becomes a poor country, or far from that. Or a lot of people in the United States are poor, but the United States as a poor country, that's not in the offset. But we will see a global rebalancing.
Wonderful. So this actually leads to my next question, which is, what were the main policy responses to the environment, especially from an EU and US perspective? Julia already hinted that both sides of the Atlantic are engaged in industrial policies, tariffs, a new way of plurilateralism. So Julia, from your perspective, especially from the US, what were the main policy responses to this environment? And then we'll go to the...
and again, you have the Biden administration approach to the CHIPS and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. And this is an attempt to bet US debt against future revenue. So that's why it's actually supposed to be the Inflation Reduction Act. Well, we'll see when it actually reduces. But again, it was an attempt to decide what part of the economy has to be produced at home, and how are we going to compete internationally? And if that's producing chips, or it's trying to, again, the Inflation Reduction Act was sort of it had three prongs. It had create jobs, it had, bring upon the energy transition, which wouldn't happen without government participation. And of course, compete with China, which has put a lot of money and effort behind the energy transition itself. If you drive around Beijing now, you don't really hear very much because all the cars are electric. If you drive around Berlin right now, all you'll do is inhale diesel fumes. And so there's an aspect of industrial response. Now, if the Trump administration had its way on this, I don't know what, I mean, again, they're gonna end up renaming some of these bills, so it sounds like they did it. It didn't. The success is not due to the predecessor. I don't care. It's like, I mean, as long as it bears economic fruit. But that's why I don't think you haven't seen them really rip up a lot of these, or try to rip up any of these signature pieces of, the legislation, which means you're not going to get rid of them anyway. That at least you need 2/3 to do that. But you haven't really seen them water them down on the regulatory basis either. It's because everybody is profiting off of the system. All the Republican states would scream if suddenly all these new factories that had been opened in their jurisdiction were going to be shuttered. So that's the most cogent policy response. I don't think that we're going to ultimately get that much out of, or we will get some, because it's open season now to lobby Trump for your tariffs. So everybody is running in there saying, well, the Japanese against my potatoes and this and that and the other thing. And so we're going to get some sort of smattering of retaliatory tariffs based on some, in the industries that screamed the loudest to say that they feel disadvantaged at home. So maybe it'll lead to some reshoring of intermediate production. Okay, a lot of foreign companies are doing that anyway, because then you're close to your market, the Americans being grand consumers. So there'll be some reshoring of production, but it won't necessarily be reshoring it in anything that's set for the future. I mean, that's the sort of, I mean, I'm all about U.S. whiskey and all this stuff. So it's going to end up being the kind of the people who scream the loudest, and where you're going to see the most movement around the edges, and probably less where it actually matters.
Okay, thank you, Julia and Elaine. What is the perspective from you? What were the main policy responses to this environment, especially as we still hear the language of de-risking?
Well, absolutely. There's been a very significant shift for the EU towards its digital strategic autonomy, whatever that might be, or digital sovereignty in the last number of years. Everything from cloud computing to cyber to net zero clean tech. We see the EU is just replete with this massive digital agenda going into overdrive, and having to push back a little bit on this, but in particular, its Data Governance Act and Digital Services Act, even labeled by the Biden administration to be anti-American, and now obviously the source of huge ire in the new White House. And a lot of these instruments are interesting because they're not really industrial policy, they're not really external relations, but they are very much couched in very defensive protectionist terms against not just the US, also China. And the EU has very limited legal powers. It only has really the internal market and a limited number of other elements. It's not like it can engage in massive legislative agendas. So it'll be interesting, Thomas, to see what survives in increasingly European Parliament that has shifted so much to the right. We also, I suppose, the ultimate policy response of the last cooperation with the Biden administration was, of course, the Trade and Technology Council that really has very few concrete legal outcomes of any interest, and lots of scoping and interesting work, but ultimately in terms of output is very soft in its orientation, although it's in very detailed work on AI, and that already looks like it has certainly bit the dust, and to some extent antitrust was put outside. Anything really controversial, or the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act stuff, was put outside, and so the language pivot of policy towards, in particular, workers' rights in developing countries was, quite interesting to see the EU do this. But I think, as Julia mentioned, the really important stuff that's happening is kind of global configurations here on how to live outside the WTO, how to deal. I'm Irish, and looking at there's a huge concern in Ireland as to digital services taxes, the lack of a global agreement on this, how to get the new White House on their side. There's going to be very strong overtures against Ireland, particularly as to big pharma, the Irish, Dutch taxation systems being very much couched in very friendly terms to engage a certain type of US multinational and engage a certain type of corporate structure, and how this can be, the circle can be squared in the absence of an international agreement remains to be seen. But it's not just, of course, the future of the WTO. I mean, it still has some salience for a very significant number of countries, or the US agenda against the International Criminal Court, when you're putting very significant sanctions against officials, is also shows that international institutions are in a difficult time, but there is certainly an appetite of a very large number to do things. And the last administration of the Biden administration even signed up to a Council of Europe agreements on AI, and has certain important work done on global privacy. So I think it'll be it's important to remember that there's a lot of necessity to cooperation in these infrastructures, or around these infrastructures. It just may not be as we have seen them or known them in the past.
Wonderful. So that brings me on to my next question, which is, what has been the immediate impact of this climate on EU-US economic relations? It's very clear from the commentary so far, especially as said in Julia and by Elaine, that there are quite disparities when it comes to the regulatory approaches in the EU and the US. Despite the fact that in some areas, for example, the sanctions coordination against Russia in the aftermath of the war of Ukraine did show a degree of cooperation between both sides of the Atlantic. But what fundamentally has impacted this relationship in light of this emerging geostrategic climate? We'll start with Julia and then Elaine.
Sure, thank you. And I mean, I of course cheered on the close coordination of the EU sanctions, or G7, G7 driven, but then EU plus US plus Canada plus, sanctions against Russia after the escalation in 2022. But in a lot of ways, those measures were already negotiated. So I was in the Treasury Department when, for the first time in 2014, when we were, first had to say, oh God, we have to sanction Russia, trying to figure out a sort of escalation ladder, what that would look like. If Russia did this, we'll do that. So a lot of the measures that ended up being sort of pulled out of the hat in the first couple of days, the reason why they came off as so powerful is because we'd already agreed to them with the EU 8 years earlier. But I think that, for all that, right, and it was a reprieve, I don't think it's sort of grisly to say that a war is a reprieve, but it was a harkening back to a sort of traditional model of how the US and the EU were supposed to coordinate, right? It was like, let's focus on NATO, and we have a pro-NATO Cold Warrior US president, and we have this conflict where this underdog in Ukraine is being attacked by Russia. So now we can all just sort of pick up our bootstraps and sit together, right? But it was sort of if everybody believed that all forms of regulatory negotiations with the EU were going to work like that, right? You're sort of deceiving yourselves. So again, like the negotiation, I'm a big fan of the sanctions, and how it, the resolve that it showed to Putin, who did not expect it, nor did she expect it. But at the same time, it's in the end an outlier, because it sort of represented an old framework of thing. The weird positive angle here is that businesses are still working as usual. They'll complain about, again, if things get really bad, they're going to call and they're going to complain to their representatives and to industry associations, and if you have enough access, directly to the White House. But if you talk to people who are working on the ground, I was just invited to some thing in Berlin that was just like the something Wisconsin partnership on biotech with the state of Hesse, right, where Frankfurt is. And so I was just sort of like, okay, you have all these people yelling at the top, and then down where it really matters, people are doing hard work. And so I think it's, you can believe the headlines, and they're scary enough, but in the end, the private sector and local governments are really driving the agenda in the US and European economic cooperation, where despite everything, businesses will still say it's a positive climate. the recent changes to German spending laws last week with the incoming chancellor are a very positive thing for European market development and for the sort of reemergence of European spending capacity, right? Germany being the biggest European country, and let's just say with a debt to GDP ratio of something like 63%, had a little bit of borrowing capacity compared to everybody else in Europe. And so that's being seen very positively in European markets, but also being seen very positively in US markets, who, I remember in just 2 months ago, I was speaking at an investors conference in New York, and I was like, and it was all these American investors talking about Germany, and they took me, and I was the lunch speaker, as hear about Europe and Germany from an American mouth. And I had a lot of, I had trouble convincing them to still believe that Germany in the European Union was a positive investable object for our US investors. And I would say Trump's insecurities and the German spending package have changed the perspective for transatlantic investment in a different way than I wouldn't have anticipated just a few weeks ago.
And Elaine, your thoughts?
Yeah, I suppose one thing that was very interesting to me to observe in recent times is how the Irish government have been lobbying the White House as to understanding what is a trade imbalance and understanding what the EU has been investing in the US and how European companies are not all what it seems, or how to change the narrative. And I think that changing of the narrative is really important as to sanctions. There's this massive wave of expertise emerging on sanctions. People having to do this who haven't been doing it for many years. But as Julia said, the EU and US are some of the world's largest sanctions actors. The EU has really expanded its schemes of sanctions, and this kind of mirroring of approaches, alignment with the transatlantic approach has been, it's been quite significant to see the number of countries aligning with the EU and US, particularly on sanctions in recent times. And judging like how the mood is for the enlargement of Europe and the widening, or understanding what Europe is, I think comes into play in this, on who are in the terms allies. I think has taken on board some there's some interesting research being done in this. Maybe the broader question, I think, on certainly wearing my UK hat at the moment, the UK is in the last government have so many non-binding agreements with US states, and expelling the virtues of those agreements to the tune of very significant amounts of funds have been mocked in certain corners, certain in economic policy circles, trade circles, about non-binding trade agreements and MOUs with states. But I think, as Julia said, shows that there's a lot of activity on the ground. I mean, from a legal perspective as well, mutual recognition agreements have been historically not very successful, and there's many failures in transatlantic cooperation, even across positive relationships or more converged relationships, if we use those terms. So I think seeing how regulatory cooperation fell off the agenda in the TTC to a very different type of reshaping of global policy, very global ambitions, means we pivoted into a very different type of environment now. But there is there's a lot of scale and capacity there, and there still is a lot of there's lots of very important developments. I mean, perhaps even if the US joins the Commonwealth, as has been mooted in the last few days, this might make a very very different understanding of what international organizations means in terms of scale in current times.
Well, I see there's almost a bit of consensus that the rhetoric, the fragmentation, appears to be at the top when it comes to the discourse around transatlantic economic relations. So I want to situate that reality by what's happening presently, which is that amongst this climate, we are witnessing probably one of the most important periods in the 22nd century, the advent of AI innovations, as highlighted by the launch of ChatGPT, DeepSeek, Google's Gemini, and the rapid advancement in quantum chip production. So in the medium to long term, so that could be beyond the present administration or even the present commission, particularly in the aftermath of the recent election cycles, what will be the impact of this emerging climate on EU-US regulatory cooperation in these emerging technologies? We'll start with Elaine and then Julia.
Yeah, so I think the EU's efforts to be a first mover and a global leader in a lot of data regulation is kind of unquestionable. And I suppose the sentiment seems to be to across the board, and AI has one of the world's first binding laws as a regional entity, not the world's first, but the Council of Europe has a binding legal agreement, and the US engagement with all of that and the efforts to align their taxonomies, their understanding of the terms, the words, the learning of the US NIST from the EU's AI board, work as the OECD, works the G20, you know, even if they are not subscribed to by the current US administration, that there was a very, very deep engagement with EU efforts to regulate this and to take it forward. And I think it'll be very interesting to see how unavoidable regulation is in this field in going forward, or how much the EU's infrastructure on the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, the Data Act, and the AI Act will be un-American, or how much of the enforcement of this will be the subject of important learning for other jurisdictions. We see Canada, Australia in particular taking very significant leads from the EU on the GDPR. Canada is just there's a huge amount of and all over the world, and many US states have been signing up to ideas of the need for comprehensive privacy infrastructure across the political fence, as it were, as far as I understand. And I think those are important developments that will be of use going forward. I think the UK is an interesting one because they tried to break away with the US at a recent AI summit, and to try to catch down the language slightly differently in all this. And I think those debates are quite interesting because we witness a bit more of a clash as to the EU's efforts to be this first mover. And in fact, it's actually quite a boring legal infrastructure it's put forward just to AI. It's just product, regulate a product liability, whereas the Council of Europe says it's all about human rights. So those are interesting debates, and they're philosophical, but those are quite practical. And they will bear out in the transatlantic relationship unavoidably. And I think the EU and US did fantastic work in the TTC, but how much of that can be cast aside is an interesting question, since it was very much a soft law development from a legal perspective.
I agree with all of that. I think that the U.S. will remain, whether it will say so or not, a policy taker in a lot of these regulatory areas. And that's, it's driven, we are a federalized country. If California adopts GDPR, lo and behold, the entire US will adopt it. Maybe not saying it is, but we do, right? You get the same pop-up thing, like asking you for your preferences in the US than you do in the EU. Although, of course, like there are recognitions at the EU level right now that a lot of these regulatory obligations that were imposed over the past decade or so have now worked to the detriment of European competitiveness. And so there's a little bit of an effort towards red tape slashing in Brussels, to particularly with regards to reporting requirements, and we'll see sort of an unwinding of ESG rules in the coming months is my prediction. But on the other hand, the US is going to follow an EU lead. Ultimately speaking, of course, this does, we tend to respond to EU regulations rather so asymmetrically. So if there's a data regulation, we might respond with a digital services, not a digital services tax. But I mean, again, there are all different sort of ways that the US and EU sometimes calculate where revenue is generated, and I could see that ending up. And this is, I think, but what Elaine was alluding to with the global taxation agreements, how actually, the first Trump administration, we almost had a OECD global taxation agreement on digital services, which was blown up by one or two EU states ultimately, and then also by the US Congress, which was clearly not going to sign on to it, even though we actually had an agreement between the Trump administration, the US Treasury Department, and most of the bodies of the OECD. So again, tricky little space to navigate. On the other, but one issue on antitrust, which is, again, this is something where there is a growing appreciation in the United States for trust busting. The first Trump administration had this. It expanded widely under FTC chairwoman Lina Khan under the Biden administration. But despite all of the appearance of the tech giants at Trump's inauguration, there is a very strong antitrust wave within certain parts of the U.S. Republican Party. So watch appointments there very closely. JD Vance is a big fan of Lena Khan's, and so again, you could say this has to going back at some of the US tech giants for doing content moderation, maybe that it has to do with that. But again, motivations aside, there are some strange bedfellows about how to regulate some of the big tech players between the US and the EU. And I think a lot of players in the US would like to see the field be shaken up a little bit. Ultimately, it's anti-competitive behavior hurts economic growth. So we'll see how Silicon Valley reacts to that.
Thank you, Julia. And in the interest of time, because I know Julia has to leave around the 45-minute mark, I'll combine the next two questions by asking as a follow-up, what key forums or platforms could be bridged in encouraging further cooperation, especially when it comes to the regulation of these emerging technologies, but also digital actors? And as already mentioned by Julia, some of the real work is happening at the state level and also via these Chamber of Commerce and business sector. Elaine even mentioned how Ireland is even making overtures with the White House in understanding how this US deficit happened and the EU's role in this. So what are the informal arrangements should we consider that could be an area of further regulatory cooperation? We'll start with Julia and then Elaine.
I think that I think ultimately there's going to be a very big discussion about monetary policy, about where, what is the role of the US dollar globally as the reserve currency. Some have been trying to come out from under the yoke of transacting in US dollars, whether it's through trade settlement or actually by the purchasing of debt, and of course clearing of transactions. So we'll see a bit of that, but there's a stream coming through, and again, I don't know where this is going to go, that really sort of blames trade deficits on deindustrialization of the United States, essentially that foreign countries were buying up our debt at cheap prices, and then using it to fund their own export-based economies while the US essentially used that positive interest environment to fuel our spending and of course our consumer markets. I don't buy into this, but I think that there is a bit of there's going to be some runway on the theories in the coming months about devaluing the dollar, and about retooling of debt markets globally. This doesn't necessarily have to be, if it comes out, but in order to do that, you need to get China on board. So again, this is a broader agreement that, the last time they did this was in the 1980s. But then, the debt environments were basically all the G7. It led to the sort of stagnation of the Japanese economy as a result. But again, that was, if China agrees to voluntary export restrictions in exchange for stability in debt markets, we could see a little bit of a rejiggering about how we sort of calculate GDP and how we finance our economies. What the effect of that will have on the development of big tech, I think whether we're channeling large amounts of essentially foreign earned credit into state subsidies of certain technologies. So it's a bit of a stretch, but I can sort of see someone trying to weave that together.
Thank you, Julia. And before you leave, is there still a role for the TTC?
I mean, I think the TTC itself is probably in its format is probably dead for a little while. Doesn't mean that the regulators aren't going to be talking to each other. It doesn't mean that businesses aren't going to be talking to each other and sort of establishing informal standards. But I think that the current environment to be cozy, and again, like the TTC was established by the Biden administration in order to appear cozy while they were still arguing over Boeing Airbus tariffs and steel and aluminum. Again, the Boeing Airbus is long, like, I don't know how 18-year dispute at the WTO is not settled. It's on ice. And the steel and aluminum tariffs that the first Trump administration put into place are still there. The TTC was to try to find all these areas of cooperation to sort of pretend like all that wasn't happening. So I think the Trump administration now is happy to pretend that it's all happening. But again, like, it doesn't, just because the like sort of the big fluffy political, open displays of friendship aren't there, doesn't mean that stuff is not happening under the woodwork. So.
Wonderful. Thank you, Julia. And Elaine, what are your thoughts? Are there any other informal arrangements that we should look out for that could be areas for deeper EU-US regulatory cooperation? Julia already mentioned that the TTC could possibly be dead, but that the real work will still happen on the state and business to business and stakeholder to stakeholder interactions. So what are your thoughts, Elaine?
Yeah, absolutely. I would definitely agree with that. The Trade and Technology Council was an extraordinary amount of cooperation, executive to executive. Was it 2 ministerials a year? I think officials found themselves to be so overburdened by it, even in a very cooperative relationship. And I think it's very likely to see a very different form of engagement. I don't think that was at all sustainable. I suppose the broader point for me is about kind of the place of institutions and understanding where to cooperate and how, and enforceability in the era of soft digital partnerships, or questions about how to in the enforcement agenda and it's not just in the transatlantic relations, the broader relationship of in a world where the WTO has been definitively weakened, but the digitization of economy is very much it hasn't gone away. I think there's a question about the transatlantic legislators dialogue in the chat that maybe I think is a really interesting and important question that has for a long time been seen to be a very important place for engagement between the EU and US, and you're perhaps dismissed as a talking shop by many people, but the breadth of the scope of the agenda is so much larger than trade and technology. And if anything, one of the main criticisms of the Trade and Technology Council is that the transatlantic relationship is broader than that. That's such a narrow take on it and had a very selective cutting out of other things. But I mean, the transatlantic legislative dialogue looks at things like migration and so on, and those are important exchanges of views that take place in a structured and meaningful way. And I suppose the broader point is how to understand, who's in the European Parliament and the domestic, values and objectives at an international level amongst, getting those with an interest in Europe in Congress, for example, has been said by many officials to be a complex thing. So there will be undoubtedly much more of an emphasis upon soft law and softer forms of institutional infrastructures, but that's not to, and that is the new reality, right? Memoranda of understanding and state to state. But I do think that there are huge challenges to seeing that as being the new normal, because the EU in particular has this very different understanding of enforcement of rights and individual rights, and the importance of its values as set out in its treaty.
Wonderful. And to close, what key trends, whether domestically or internationally, should we look out for in 2025 that could impact any prospect for deeper EU's regulatory cooperation in emerging technologies. So I'm thinking about possibly the elections in Canada, threat of tariffs, possibly a reconfiguration in EU or US policy, or the prospects of a global economic downturn. Elaine, you have.
Lots of really great suggestions in there. I suppose I'm very much fascinated by this shift towards an industrial policy and external the digital external relations of the EU as it's become very sophisticated in an internal perspective, and how going forward these issues converge. What you need to compete with the US or against and China in the next year. Is it more industrial relations? Is it more external relations? Is it more competition policy? I'm not sure the legal infrastructure gives a very clear answer. The EU is very much overusing its very limited internal powers to do quite a lot. It's been very successful on one front and looks likely to run into many roadblocks. So I would say how we see, what is the character of the type of protectionism in a world of digitization, the digital transformation, be it clean tech or net zero, cloud computing, cyber. I don't know. There's so many things that you can put into the basket of what it is. But I think the EU has is not a very nimble organization, I would say, and that from a legal perspective becomes interesting against a US president with tremendous legal capacity to be nimble on discrete issues.
Wonderful. Well, that comes to our brief Q&A. And as Elaine, you already partially answered the first question by Monica Velasco. I have a question that I received via email from one of our attendees, Hannes Berggren from the National Board of Trade, who mentioned the recent findings of a report on economic security and EU-US digital trade. So I know this is your area of expertise, Professor. So in sum, it prefers that EU-US digital cooperation could be a pathway to de-escalate trade tensions through a digital agreement, one that safeguards data flows, enhances regulatory cooperation on economic security, and includes provisions on digital security. What are your thoughts on this approach? Could such an approach be feasible in that aspect?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think it's a very important point. It would be the ideal situation. Obviously, there's very important issues as to the WTO e-commerce agreement, the future of the Transatlantic data privacy agreement, politics surrounding the civil liberties board of that entity. I think that would be a very wishful, very hopeful outcome and the perfect solution. I'm not sure we're likely to see anything of that nature, or it may be repackaged. Remember, the only legal outcome of the Trump 1 administration is probably a very curious form of lobster agreement, mini agreement, based on a very esoteric part of the EU treaties and not a kind of conventional entity. And this idea of scale and size and legal tools can't be dismissed. We would all like to see what the question asks. I think it would be very sensible and very forward thinking, but I think it's much more transactional, much more practical, immediate, discrete. The lobster agreement was responding to the EU's agreement with CETA and Canadian fishermen, and it's a bit like thinking about, for me, for Brexit, one of the most important political issues was something that was a tiny part of the UK economy, and it doesn't make a lot of sense, but had a lot of legal powers. Fisheries is quite significant for some people. So I think we need to rescale our ambitions, our objectives, and also remember the legal tools are what they are, and that leads to certain outcomes.
Okay, so on that note, cautious and be cognizant of the legal tools available. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of today's webinar, but I'd like to extend my thanks to our guests, Professor Elaine Fahey and Ms. Julia Friedlander, for the insightful remarks in this evolving debate. And thank you, our audience, for your participation and questions. We really appreciate it. Have a wonderful week, and I'll see you all next time. Thank you, Professor.